So let's see. I think we can start now. Probably, time is of the essence really today. So probably, yeah. So if I may. So today we have. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Today we have our Honourable Lady Britta Augsburg, who is an Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. She has done a lot of research on sanitation over the past 15 years, and today she'll be talking about Nigeria Sanitation Challenge, which was basically in reference to 2018, 2019, when we had the government of Nigeria basically declare a state of emergency because of the poor conditions of water, sanitation and health in Nigeria. So with that, I'm going to let Britta Augsburg, Honourable Speaker today, take the lead and start the presentation, really. Thank you very much, Britta.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction and the invitation, and for joining me on Valentine's evening. Very special. I have a tendency to talk relatively fast. I realize that's not ideal in general and not in a virtual and room kind of combined setting. So do stop me if I get too fast or you don't understand or the connection is not good, or if you have questions. I don't know if everybody's economist, but economists are very used to being interrupted. So please just do so if you think necessary. So yeah, I'm at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which most people rather know for announcements around the budget or analysis of UK policies, but we do have a team that work on development, so issues in developing countries, where the approach we take is very similar. It's a micro analysis that we do, microeconomic analysis. And in a way, often the overarching questions are similar, kind of what produces human capital, what helps child health, but then in different contexts and thinking about different constraints. So I thought I'd talk today about sanitation and sanitation in Nigeria more specifically. Since economists don't often talk about sanitation, let me just give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about it. Basically, it's defined as the provision of facilities and services for safe disposal of human urine and feces. Sorry to have that on slide one. I'm very used to talking about that so far. But basically, think about toilets. Not sure that'll be the best topics for a date that you might still have tonight, but maybe makes it interesting. In the context that I'll talk about, these are like often not the toilets that people have. You can think more of a toilet like this. So there's wide agreement that sanitation is very important. For example, the readers of the British Medical Journal, they chose the sanitation revolution, think of introducing sewage, etc., as the greatest medical advance since 1840. And it has also been kind of more recently been adopted or acknowledged as one of the key drivers that would allow to end extreme poverty by 2030. So that's important because it's kind of doesn't think just about sanitation improves health, but it thinks further, and health is an important input into human capital production. At the same time, though, it's really a big challenge in developing countries. So about 4.5 billion people, that's more than half of the world population, have no access to adequate sanitation. And the second toilet I showed you there, that counts as proper access to sanitation. And so it has been kind of deemed by WaterAid as an international NGO that we work with in Nigeria. They called it the biggest global development challenge of this century, or the New York Times was saying it's kind of the greatest untold development challenge facing the community today. If we look more at Nigeria specifically, so there's about 80 million people in 2019 that were without access to improved sanitation. And with that, Nigeria is the country that's set to become the one that has most people openly defecating in the world. So basically go behind bushes or wherever they can go. And if you think about water, sanitation and hygiene, it's often talked about wash in general. Also, the drinking water hand washing situation is very dire in the country. And specifically for Nigeria, some of the estimated consequences, and there's a lot of evidence for these types of consequences in general context as well, is they estimate there's a lot of premature mortality. So there's morbidity that comes from it. You might have diarrhea, etc., but mortality then follows, and that's the more severe outcome, of course. Estimated that about 240 children die every day due to lack of safe water and sanitation. Similarly, you can think that it's estimated that people lose on average, some might not lose any, some might lose a lot more, 2.5 days a year, just finding a safe place where they can go. And you can add these types of costs up. That's healthcare, that's time spent, that's tourism that won't come to the country, etc. And it's estimated that Nigeria loses at the moment about 1.3% of GDP because of that sanitation. Now the government has recognized this issue, and the president, like Swan was already mentioning, has declared a state of emergency in 2018. And it has kind of committed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So giving access to sanitation has been taken up in the Sustainable Development Goals of reducing or eliminating openification. And importantly, so there is federal support for the states, and the support will be discontinued if they don't implement the National Action Plan. Now, one part of this strategy, it was actually already the national policy in terms of sanitation before the state of emergency was declared, is community-led total sanitation. It was introduced in 2008, and some years later, we, well, let me get to that, but basically, yeah, I'll get to that, sorry. So they adopted community-led total sanitation. And this is something that many countries have, an approach that many countries have adopted. So by 2015, 24 countries, many in Africa, but also in Latin America and in South Asia, had adopted this approach to battle the problem of openification in their countries. What is this approach? So it aims as a sustained change in social norms and thinking around what's right in terms of sanitation towards increasing the demand, and then by that abandon this, this behavior of basically making the environment dirty. And it's implemented in 3 steps. It's at the community level, that's why it's called community-led total sanitation. You first approach the community leader, engage him or her, get them on board, and plan the next 2 steps, which is the important one is triggering activities where community members are brought together and a set of activities are being done. What's always part of it is kind of a mapping of the community. So people draw a map on the floor, they put where the houses are, and then they look, okay, who has a toilet, who doesn't, where do people go that don't have one? And very often actually show on paper, on the floor in picture, that people live in their own shit, you could almost say, right? I'm sorry to use these, I hope it's not too bad that I can talk about it, so use the word so openly. But with that, then kind of to trigger this understanding, once that's done, sometimes people also go around and point out, look, here it is, here's where our kids play, and still this is where people go, etc. With that, they then make a plan, how to change the situation. And then people often from an NGO or they like follow up with community members, whether the plan is implemented, etc. Importantly, this is really purely this idea of triggering the community and creating demand. There's no transfers, there's no subsidies, there's no credit that is provided or anything. There's no training of masons that to give the right knowledge on how to build proper toilets for the context. So they're like, it's really just thinking, once we have the demand, the supply will follow, kind of the idea. Now, and there's been quite a few studies actually around this approach. There's at least 5 randomized controlled trials that evaluated in different contexts, and they have very varied findings. So there's, for example, a study in Indonesia, another one in Bangladesh, that cannot identify any impacts of the intervention. And if you go to the other end of the spectrum, there's a study in Mali where CLTS increases toilet ownership and reduces openification by about 30 percentage points. And in this study, they are also actually able to show health impacts of that come with this improvement in sanitation access. Now, there's, of course, the question then, okay, what does that mean? How effective is CLTS really? And maybe can we identify an underlying factor that can rationalize the differences, right? Is there an explanation why it works in one context and another that can then maybe even be used for targeting of how should CLTS be implemented if the government decides to adopt this? And this is kind of what we are tackling with a study that I'm going to talk about more. So in 2013, we teamed up with this NGO WaterAid. So it's WaterAid UK and also WaterAid in Nigeria. And we evaluated the implementation of CLTS. So the government of Nigeria relies on NGOs to implement their national strategy, basically. So you can think of it as really evaluating the way the government approaches CLTS. The intervention was implemented in 3 states, in Ekiti, Enugu, and Jigawa. We did the evaluation in 2, partly because of budgetary reasons, partly because of security concerns, because the 3rd state is in the north of Nigeria. I'm not sure whether you are aware of kind of how randomized control trials work, but if you think of an evaluation, ideally you have a group that gets the intervention and you have a group that doesn't get the intervention, so you can compare these 2 groups. Now, if you just compare where WaterAid decides to implement versus where they don't want to implement, you might have problems with this comparison, because maybe they choose to implement only where really hardly anyone has a toilet, and then the comparison villages are those where people already have toilets, and that comparison isn't fair. So what you can do is you can ask the NGO to say, okay, where do you plan to implement? And if you have more funds, where would you go? And then randomly select which communities they actually go to. In this case, you have 2 groups that you can compare and actually see whether outcomes differ after some time. I'm talking community level. I'm happy to talk more about how we actually selected this, because it wasn't as straightforward. And then we conducted data collection on communities and on households before the intervention and 3 times after the intervention. So 8, 24, and 32 months after. Let me briefly stop here just to make sure that I'm not losing anyone, that you can hear me and it's okay to follow.
Yep. Any questions so far? No, everyone seems to catch up with you. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. So here's what we find. We find that average impacts are really small. So in line with the other studies that I mentioned in Indonesia, Bangladesh, for example, we find that overall open defecation reduces by 3 percentage points. And these adjustments are immediate. So we measure the first time 6 months afterwards, and that's where we see these impacts. They're sustained for some time, but then they disappear on the 32 months after implementation. But we also find that these average impacts, they actually hide important heterogeneity. When we look at poor versus rich communities, where we use asset information on households and aggregate that up at the community level and kind of separate the communities into asset poor and asset rich on average, we find that open defecation is reduced in poor communities by 7 to 9 percentage points. Now, comparing that to other programs that were evaluated that aimed at reducing open defecation or increasing sanitation, it's actually a pretty good achievement, if you want to say. Like, many interventions don't get much beyond 10 percentage points. We also find no impact at all in rich communities. And this difference is statistically, well, and economically significant. We consider this distinction rich and poor because, well, the community level is important because it's a community intervention, right? And the pioneers of the intervention, Chamalka and Robert Chambers, they suggested actually that this might be an important margin along which CLTS could work better or worse. In the extreme case, like in urban areas, CLTS is typically not used, for example. Now, the obvious question that one might ask is, yeah, well, fine, but this is a bit random. Couldn't it be something else, right? You could think poor communities are probably having less toilets. And so then if you come and say build toilets, there's more people that can react to this intervention. And you could think of other margins that poor and rich communities can differ, like public infrastructure. Are there really good roads that you can transport materials into the communities? Do you have the relevant masons? There's a number of margins that we show that these rich and poor are actually also different. However, when we replicate the analysis using all these different indicators, we do not find the same type of impacts that we do find by community wealth. Including if we check toilet ownership. This is not to say that that they are not important, that they don't matter. I mean, you might really think that, you know, it was obviously relevant that people don't have toilets to make such an intervention work, right? But what we're saying is that if you want to have a measure, like a summary measure, community asset wealth is actually a good one to consider. And it is encompassing other reasons that are maybe important, but not as important as this community wealth. So what we bring forward is that this is a key indicator of effectiveness of CLTS, and that the government of Nigeria can actually use it to target its resources in a more efficient manner than it's currently doing. And we give a simple example that one can use secondary data to do this targeting. So based on the 2013 Demographic and Health Survey, these are surveys that are available in most countries and they collect measures of wealth. You can recreate a similar measure that we have in the Nigerian context, and then kind of just see where do we have high and low asset wealth. In this case, it would be mainly in the north of the country. State level is maybe not as good. It'd be nicer to have more fine-grained geographical information when you have to, like, I guess depends what one has access to. But this was just to illustrate. Now, then, of course, I told you before that there is a number of studies and that the results differ quite substantially across the context. So it's the question whether, okay, the Nigerian government can use it according to our findings, but is it something that other countries could consider as well? So for that, we do a number of exercises, but I'll just talk about one that I think results in a graph that I quite like, and it's a relatively simple approach. So we access the data from these 5 randomized control trials. And we then, the idea is to plot their wealth against the impact that we find. Now, we don't have the same type of information on assets in the surveys that were collected in these randomized control trials. So using asset is not like the same indicator that we put forward, doesn't work well. But what we can use that's comparable across context is nightlight intensity. That's data that's publicly available and it's been shown to correlate with wealth and development and other margins that are comparable to wealth. And so we are able to just kind of have nightlight on the x-axis and the size of the impact on the y-axis. We do a bit more to re-estimate the same approach across countries, but basically that's it. And this is what we find. So the bars are the nightlight intensity. On the left side, there's very low nightlight intensity, Mali, Tanzania, our low asset wealth areas in Nigeria. And on the right side, you see the areas with high nightlight intensity. So that's Indonesia. And in Indonesia, we have more of an asset wealth. So we can also kind of make 2 bins here. And then the low darker dots are the impact estimates on toilet ownership, and the lighter dots are impact estimates on openification. So they are, of course, they are not, of course, but they're the opposite. And here is the no impact line. Here's the 0 on the left-hand side as the for impacts. And if you see in the areas where there's high nightlight intensity, there's 0 impacts. And the significant impacts are really just where there's very low nightlight intensity. So it kind of supports our idea that you can use this as a targeting also in other contexts and kind of get an explanation for the different results that have been shown in the literature. So do you have a question?
I should interject there, but some members are thinking about what do you mean by nightlight intensity exactly?
So this is really, like these satellite maps that where you can see at night how much light there is? That's basically it. So that's captured in a number. So if it's, to be honest, now here, if it's 0, it's a black dot on the map. I can't put 10 now into context. I'm not sure what London, for example, be, but London would be very high up on the map because you have a lot of activity at night, so a lot of light on. Is that?
Brilliant, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so you can think of usually where there would be a lot of night light, or you could think night activity even that. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So basically what we're then summarizing is that, okay, in Nigeria, we see that CLTS can be effective, but only in poor communities. We also kind of show that, and I just hinted at that before, that the reduction of openification comes through toilet construction. It could also be that people had toilets, but just didn't use them, which is often shown in the context of India, for example. But here we see really that construction goes aligned with decreasing open defecation, and that these heterogeneous impacts based on wealth can rationalize differential impacts that we see in other studies. And that there's these implications for targeting that we think is also relevant for other contexts. Now, worth considering, though, that A is the point that CLTS is not effective in richer communities. And when I say richer, that's not rich, that's just, you know, within the context of the communities that we were considering, they were not as poor. And even in communities, in poor communities, there is still, after implementation of CLTS, a large fraction of households that continue to defecate in the open. So what I want to kind of now do for the last, I guess, 5 minutes or so, sorry if I run over, I don't know, I don't have track of time, is to talk a little bit whether CLTS, what do we know about adjustments to CLTS, and whether what type of complementary other strategies one could consider. And that's kind of building on work that me and colleagues and co-authors have been doing. So one is to think about implementation adjustments. And here we did also an RCT that was embedded in a different program where in certain areas CLTS was implemented. This was in Pakistan, but then we randomized whether the communities received follow-up activities or not. So the way CLTS is implemented varies across context within a country even, and so there's margins to adjust and think and to change, right? And what we find is kind of a little bit in line with Nigeria. So we find that CLTS did not reduce slippage back to open defecation, because the way to think of it here is that people have a toilet, maybe because of CLTS or not, we can't establish that in this context, but then there's evidence that a lot of people stop using them. And so we, on average, don't see that the stop is really stopped, but we do again find heterogeneity in it, and we find that in vulnerable regions, so that's defined along several margins. So for example, where there's low public infrastructure, there's no access to sanitation, to shops that sell the right products, etc. So that there, the reduction in the increase in open defecation again after they had a toilet is kind of stopped, right? So they don't fall back. And so we say intensity of follow-up matters, especially in regions where there is not like the infrastructure to easily uptake your toilet, because it's not just about building, it's also about maintenance, right? You have to continue to put effort to have like an investment that you can use then later on. And that's kind of in line when you, in Mali, the study that I was mentioning that found really high impacts, they actually had quite frequent follow-up visits. They went bi-weekly for 1 to 3 months afterwards, which is much more than many other contexts what's being done. So that can be seen as some further descriptive evidence to say that if the context is very poor, you might want to consider more follow-up. We then can also think of complementary strategies. And so you want to ask about, so what might be the constraints that are not addressed with CLTS and that are likely binding for people to change their behavior? And I mentioned that CLTS is actually without any financial help, right? Like there's no credit that's provided or there's no subsidy that's given. When on the other hand, you ask households, and these are in 4 areas, so in Ekiti and Enugu in the 2 states in Nigeria, and then in 2 states in India, Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra, when you ask people, the vast majority says toilets are too expensive, I can't afford it. So in Ekiti, that's over 60%, in Enugu over 80, almost 90, and in Nigeria, very similar. So for households, at least, of course, you might say one thing, and then if you really find important, invest something else. But really, this seems to be a driving force. So one want to think about ways to make the product cheaper or to get finance to the households. So as part of the study in Nigeria, there was also another intervention implemented called sanitation marketing. And the idea of this intervention is really to get the supply side ready. So part of it is to design a toilet that is cheaper to implement and that people to build and that people kind of like, that they desire to have. We actually didn't find impacts of this intervention. But there's a number of caveats. So studies don't always work the way they should, and it's probably good to also talk about that a bit. So sanitation marketing here was developed on the go while we already started to evaluate CLTS, and it was pretty slow, and the take-up as well. And so it was really a little hard to draw conclusions from this research. In general, sanitation marketing is hypothesized to be important, but there's really no rigorous evidence at this point around that. And what we don't know really is whether, I mean, the idea that you have to get the supply ready as well, you need to have suppliers that are able to construct toilets, etc., makes a lot of sense. But how to get there, whether sanitation marketing, the way it was implemented, is the right approach, we don't know. We did another study in India where credit was provided to households. So here addressing really more specifically the finance constraint, not just through the price of the product. So for a microfinance institution was already working in areas, and then it was randomly decided which areas the institution would offer also now a credit specific for sanitation. And here we find that the product is taken up and increases sanitation uptake also by 9 percentage points. And this is without the a need to link to hardware. So most of microcredit works by just giving the cash to the clients and then they invest it into their business or the like. But you might think that, you know, here you could also just provide the hardware, and in some contexts that's what's being done. But there's one study that shows that this works. But it also works without the need to link to the hardware, which is, if you think about scaling this up, is a bit more expensive. And it actually worked better than the study in the context with providing hardware. And it's also without increasing indebtedness of clients. So that's important because usually microcredit is seen for people to invest in business. And when you have a business, hopefully you'll quickly get returns so you can repay the loan. Whereas if you invest in sanitation, hopefully you get healthier, more productive, and later get higher income, but it's not obviously in the first place that you get the funds to repay. However, what we can't establish on is not really clear whether, you know, taking a sanitation loan crowded out other investments because you can take only so many loans. And also it was only for a small part of the population in a community. So it's credit clients that can't, so clients of the institution that then take a loan. So there's still only like a part that's being addressed. Then in India, the government also provided actually subsidy to households. And so we look at the complementarity between microcredit and subsidies. The subsidy provision in Nigeria is together with actually CLTS, but I'm abstracting now a little bit from that. And here, so the government gives subsidy to specifically vulnerable households. The idea being they're probably liquidity constraints and can't invest by themselves. What we find here is that two findings to briefly summarize. One is that subsidy ineligible households, so those that cannot get the subsidy, they use the credit to build toilets. And the subsidy eligible, for them it's important as well though, because the way the subsidy is designed is that people actually have to toilet. And then when they can show the toilet, they get the money. And that kind of makes sense if you think there might be corruption or they might not use the money in the right way. So you want to make sure that they build a toilet and then you give the money. Now you can use then microfinance and credit to kind of bridge this time, and just so you can make the investment and then get the money back, which also makes taking a loan less risky if you know you can get the subsidy afterwards. So you can think that a combination of public-private financing could be more effective than choosing just one of these approaches. So to kind of summarize this all up, I've provided now a lot of information, but just to kind of think a little bit more. So CLTS is a very common national strategy. It can be effective, but only in poor communities. And targeting the intervention is actually quite important because very often people think that this is relatively cheap, you know, you just have to do this triggering activity in the communities. But if you add it up, so there's been a study that looks, that I've been involved in, that others that look at the actual cost of it, and the average cost to households is about $38 US, which is the context where this implement is a lot of money. So if you really think about it, the people have to come, they listen, they spend time, etc., that gets quite expensive. And then they have to, of course, pay the toilets themselves. It's likely that adjustments to how it's implemented, the approach can improve the effectiveness, but also that is context specifics. but in the end, it will affect costs because there's a large range of how much the implementation also costs. Now, if you think of complementary and alternative strategies, they seem to be very necessary because people are left out. They don't last very long, often very long, the changes. And if you think of microcredit, it seems, at least the way we estimate the cost, to be cost neutral. So the cost of per sanitation loan to disturbed is about $45 US. It costs 96 to construct a toilet, and if you do the calculation, a break-even interest rate for the institution of 20% interest on the loan, which is also what the institution pays. So this is a very quick overview of everything. I hope it wasn't too much in the 20 minutes that you suggested to talk. But yeah, very happy to take any questions on any parts of this or about IFS Live in case someone is interested in that.
Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation, and I think that was really brilliant and informative. So we're going to start the questions from the chat and to see what question they have firstly. So we have a Favor asking, how diligently has Nigeria implemented CLTS up till today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not implemented by the government. They kind of outsource it to NGOs, etc. I'm just trying to think how to answer it. So I mean, it's difficult to get data on it, but I think NGOs that work in the context, they're very keen to do it right and implement it well. But there's also a very strong belief that this actually works. So there's very little thinking around, how can we do this better, if that's fair to say, but that's the impression that we had. So we're also in discussions now with the World Bank. So they're giving the government of Nigeria a grant to implement actually this new national action plan. And this belief that they want to hold on to CLTS, not just in Nigeria, but more generally is really there and hard to change. So yeah, there's, I guess, different sides to how to answer this. I don't know whether I should stop sharing. Maybe I will stop sharing, and then in case I bring up a slide, then I cannot see the chat. Okay, so.
Okay, the second question is, are there any reasons that are region specific, such as culture or etc., that contribute to the efficiency of CLTS in general or policies? So can I clarify, when you say acceptance of the policies, you mean by policymakers or the way people in the field? So does culture or any other factor contribute to the efficiency or acceptance of the policies in Nigeria? So in general, I think culture is super important in sanitation behavior. You have people that say, we've always done it like this is relevant. So I can talk a lot more about, so there's things in India, for example, where, father-in-laws and daughters don't want to use the same toilets. And so they might have different approach to wanting to invest, or there's other caste issues that are at play in Nigeria. A lot of women didn't want to use it because of beliefs that the heat that comes up makes them ill. And I think those is all not culture, but kind of traditional beliefs that might interact with the effectiveness. And so this and also culture, depending on how you want to define it, I think are very important. And this is what I meant with, we don't say that wealth is the thing that drives it, but wealth is what captures best the different aspects that drive it. I'm not aware of a study that looks at culture and specifically in a way of measuring it. I don't know if you have something more specific in mind, and I'm happy to comment on that also. So the third question is, what's the incentive for private funders or investors to invest in CLTS? That's a good question. So I don't know if you know Mushfiq Mubarak, he's an economist at Yale, and he once gave a brilliant talk how it came about that people brush their teeth. And in theory, like
not too long ago, it wasn't common to brush your teeth, but people, companies thought, okay, there's a great market and started to market it. And now everybody brushes teeth and buys toothbrush. And I think similar, you can think about it here in CLTS or sanitation. There's a huge market. Like I just told you the numbers of people that don't actually use toilets, that should construct them, that should maintain their toilets, etc. So there's a big market to get into actually for private funders. It's on the one side the construction and maintenance, but it's also then you can actually consider what gets into the toilets as something that's can be sold. So there is toilets that can be implemented where you have 2 pits. You use one, when it's full, you close it, you use another one in the meantime. After a year, it's really good fertilizer that can be used, right? So there's a lot of use. Urine can be used as fertilizer, etc. There are a lot of ways to make, hopefully at some point, profit from this. And so this is more an answer to get into sanitation or support sanitation than CLTS, but I think kind of the same idea applies.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that answer. So we have another question. Someone has studied that water is actually correlated with sanitation. So some regions in Nigeria do not have access to water, yet they do have access to the toilets. Does that challenge really to Nigeria at the moment?
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting in Nigeria because sanitation access is a bit higher than water, and normally water access is much higher. So it's nice to point out. So the focus of what the World Bank is doing now is more on water also than sanitation at the moment in the country. But I think it goes very much hand in hand. A lot of institutions say, or NGOs, let's work first in areas where people have access to water, because then it's easier to convince them to also take up sanitation. Or there's even interventions that have been studied that say, if everybody in the community has sanitation, you'll get access to water, kind of building on the idea that people, first of all, want water and might even invest into a toilet to get it, was shown to work. And yeah, because they're very important and complement each other, I guess. There is ways of constructing toilets that you don't need to use with water. I don't know if you want me to get into details of those, but it's not, you don't have to have water to build a toilet.
Thank you very much. So the next question is, why are NGOs, there's one spearheading the implementation instead of the government? So why are NGOs leading the implementation of CLTS instead of the government itself?
The honest answer is, I don't know, I never thought of it that way. I think there's obviously, so there's budget constraints on the side of governments on the one hand. So, like establishing a sewage network is super expensive. And that's kind of not even in the question, and then you have to find different approaches to do it. Very often there's not the priority initially to invest in sanitation, and then there is NGOs that pick it up and the combination. But how it exactly came about, I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I can't give you a really good answer to that.
Okay, really interesting question we have next. We have, since CLTS is a measure, or a measure where that relies on feelings of shame and disgust to actually mobilize people to build a toilet. Is that a surprise? Is it a surprise that, once the feeling subsides, that the measure of CLTS fails in the long term?
Good question. So a feeling of disgust, I'm not sure whether it would subside so easily, whether I, once think that actually it's disgusting that my neighbor is, let's put it in a different way. It's disgusting that my neighbor has chicken and they walk into my front yard and it's doing its business there. I think I would continue to believe that, but I might go back to the other ways. Maybe it goes back to the culture. You forget about it, you don't think. So yeah, maybe that's right. It could. I'm not sure. And I had a different thought that. But yeah, so the other thing is that shame and disgust is used as part of it. It's been criticized quite a bit because also some people just don't have the means to build a toilet, and you shouldn't also, put them into shame about it. So there's a lot of things you can criticize, and I think that's worth criticizing as well. But it's also not always the only thing used. Sometimes, I've heard the stories that people took goats away and said you'll only get it back once you build a toilet, because we now need to achieve this open defecation-free status in the village. And so that goes even beyond shaming people and doing things like almost criminal things to achieve it. So, and then of course you can imagine also that the toilet built under such circumstances might not be used. And so it's not a big surprise. I guess the big question then that as economists we like to answer is like these stories that we hear, and how far are they relevant in the bigger context. But yeah, I agree that can be an important part of the ineffectiveness in the longer term.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So one more question. We have a study in Ghana that showed actually people who tend to have the CLTS program. After that, after a few months, 6 months to be precise, people tend to either not use the toilet because of poor maintenance. So the question here is there any, what measures are there in place to guarantee the sustainability of CLTS measures once they're put in place?
So yeah, one thing I was mentioning is I think there's kind of to follow up, and I think what this actually means is just to motivate people again and say it's the importance, or even support them, right? Sometimes it's about knowledge transfer and, okay, what do I need to do? What I do now that the toilet is broken or full. So I think that's an important part. So what's been seen also, like I mentioned it, like now that the toilet is full, like people build a toilet, but then don't know what to do when because pit toilets is what's typically constructed and promoted, and then what do I do? And they go back to their old habits. In India, that's a big problem because how to empty pits. If you have two, you can do this approach that I mentioned earlier, if you have enough space for that. But otherwise, you need someone with a desludging machine to come, or what has been done is that people actually do it by hand, and manual scavenging has been forbidden by law in India, but it's still happening. But it's a caste issue as well. So there's a lot of, again, now we get back to the culture thing that play into whether something can be done or not. So that I think is part of it.
Thank you. We have one last question, I believe. So one of the last questions, to be honest. So you mentioned that you had a complementary strategy in India where you offered microcredit to people. So firstly, what was the willingness of people to take up that microcredit in India?
So the credit was offered to clients of the institution. And so I can only talk about the willingness among that population. And there we saw an uptake of 20%. So 20% of clients that could take it up, they actually did take it up. Now, if you do the math, and I remember that I mentioned that 9% constructed a toilet, it also means that about 50% of the loans were not used to actually build toilets that otherwise wouldn't have been constructed. It might still be that they invested into a toilet that they would have otherwise constructed. Now I'm getting into details of what does the RCT, what kind of coefficient does it give us? But yeah, so the short answer is 20% among that population.
Thank you very much. One final question, to be honest. So the last question is, India has been seen to reduce OD drastically over the last 20 years. So are there any key takeaways from that Indian case that we could adopt to all other countries in Africa as well, Ghana and other countries that have higher rates of OD?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in fact, politicians or policymakers, etc., from Nigeria were also brought by the World Bank to India as a case study and to show them what they did, etc. And I think the big thing in India, you can trust the numbers that they say about open defecation free status now or not, well, but the important thing is they have made big advances. And I think what really drove this was the support of the government. This idea that, what do we think of Modi, but he took it on, and that was kind of his flagship program that he pushed forward the importance and put money behind it. And that's why it's also really good that the government of Nigeria declared the state of emergency and puts kind of political pressure to get this through.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we had for today. And
really nice questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we are really grateful for your time today. And I think, yeah, that was really brilliant from you. Thank you very much, Britta.
No, thank you very much for having me and engaging. So I'm really sorry. It would have been nice to do this in person.
That's all right. Yeah, I mean, you know, with the Zoom and everything, the pandemic, we have been able to adopt a blended approach. I believe that's the future, really.
Probably helps to get more people also, then they don't need to.
I know.
Yeah.
I think that would be all then. You know, we are really grateful on behalf of the Economic Society, and we also have the Bioscience Society as well today. So we have two societies at once, and we're all really grateful for your time. And I think we are going to probably end it there. Any more questions? Any more questions? No, I think that would be all. So thank you very much, Britta. I wish to see you in person, hopefully someday, and hopefully we'll have next year event as well. You know, hopefully.
Great. Yeah. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. And
Yeah. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Oh, a favour's there. There's favour here. Oh, favour here. Is favour here in this room? Who is favour?
She's favour. It's her.
Okay, so we had no one there. I don't like watching myself.